hits it, then if you could just let me know. And
yep,
then
we're recording now.
Okay, good. Good. Well, hello, everybody. I'm just so honored to have Julia Freeland Fisher with us again for another webinar. And I'd like to make an introduction, but initially kind of restate that this is being recorded. It will be posted in the next day or two on the EdTech Specialists and the Michigan Co-op websites for viewing and reviewing. So, please take that opportunity to go back and look at these webinars, including the one from today. The other thing I want to make sure you all know is that you are very welcome to participate through the chat. And Julia, if you see those, you can read the question and respond, or Lisa can go in and jump in, or I can, and, make sure that those questions are covered. And those of you who might like to have a conversation with Julia, you're welcome to do that as well. You could put that in the chat, and then when there's a point where that would make sense, we will certainly open up your microphone. In the meantime, if you could mute yourself, that would be good, just because, and although this one sounds good, but a lot of the time we do get some feedback, so we want to just make sure that that doesn't get recorded. So, as I said, I'm just thrilled to be able to introduce Julia. Julia, the more that I get to know you and the work that you do, the more I've realized that you kind of take my brain in a different direction and it goes on its own. You make me think a little differently than I would tend to go without your perspective. And I always appreciate that. And whether it's in a conversation like we had when we ran into each other at night in Nicole, or, listening to another webinar, or, reading your books and other materials, I always feel like my brain just goes like, whoa, you got to stop a minute and really process what you're saying and go from there. And it's exciting. I love that. I love that challenge. So I would love for you to take the reins right now and really get our brains going. So thanks, Julia, for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marcia, for that kind introduction, and all for joining on a Tuesday morning. So I have to apologize, even if we're not getting feedback, I do have a very badly behaved hound dog, and I'm working from home, so there may occasionally be a few little barks and squeals in the background. We're not torturing her, she's just in the other room. And also, I just spent an exorbitant amount of money on a new computer, which for some reason the fan is going. So if you're hearing that noise, there's nothing I can do about it, but apologize in advance. I'm going to start off with just sort of summarizing the research that we've been doing at the Clayton Christensen Institute, and hope that along the way you guys will ask questions so that this is as interactive as possible, but we'll also leave some time at the end for sort of discussion, like Marcia said. For those of you who don't know, the Clayton Christensen Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that studies disruptive innovation in the public sector. And we're best known in education for our work in online and blended learning. And when I joined the Institute about 6 years ago, that was really sort of the focus of the work. When I did a webinar, Marcia, with this group years ago, or a different group, I guess, EdTech Specialists years ago, we were talking about the intersection of competency-based education and blended learning. And we continue to look at some of those trends, but along the way, I had this lurking suspicion that we weren't talking about, A, the full potential of technology in education, and B, the full sort of complexity of the opportunity equation in America. And what I started to study that culminated in a book we came out with last year is the rise of innovations that expand students' access to social capital. And we'll define what that is in a second. But if I lose any of you to fire drills at your school or other priorities, I understand we're all really busy. The crux of this argument is that we need to start treating relationships as outcomes instead of inputs in our education system. And that is both because relationships help young people to get by, but also because networks help people to get ahead. And so if we're not thinking of relationships as outcomes in their own right, we will routinely underinvest in them and not do right by our young people, particularly those furthest from opportunity. So to start off, is this interface working okay, or is my like little face showing up in a weird way? Is this okay, Marcia?
It's working great. It's working just great. Yeah.
So I start every talk with a, albeit super philosophical question for early on a Tuesday morning, which is, how did you get here? And I don't mean how did you get to work today, or in my case, upstairs in my home today, but I mean, how did you get to the current role you're playing? And relatedly, who helped you? And I think as we all take a step back and consider this, along the way, right, there are people who open doors for us, there are people who bet on us, there are people who invest in us. And what I'd argue is that all of those sort of subtle or overt moments are moments at which opportunity and access to opportunity is social, not just sort of technical and based on what we know and what we can do. Now, in our education system today, largely because of the accountability climate, right, and the clear, unambiguous focus on trying to address achievement gaps, we talk a whole lot about what students know and frankly what students don't know. And that's what economists would call students' human capital, right? What eventually the labor market will reward them for knowing and being able to do. That is critical, right? And nothing I'm about to say is discounting the value of human capital, of those skills and competencies that young people need to compete in the labor market. But I'd argue that we're focusing on what students know, and we have a major blind spot around whom students know. And the problem is that opportunity really sits at the cross section of these two. One of the statistics that undergirds our research is this, which is on average, about half of jobs come through personal connections. According to LinkedIn data, that's actually a number upwards of 80% of jobs coming through referrals, right? So we can hammer away at skills and achievement, but when it comes to access to opportunity, we actually have to think about this social side of opportunity as well. Another statistic that I don't have in this particular deck, but that's a little less instrumental and about just like getting kids jobs eventually, and more about what it means to thrive as a human, is that in the longest running studies of adult development, called the Grant and Gluck studies out of Harvard University, the leading predictor of health and happiness in old age is access to warm relationships, right? So again, relationships as outcomes is critical, both if we want to kind of stock the pond of opportunities that students can access, but also if we want to create citizens that are happy and healthy. All of you working in education, this idea that relationships matter is not sort of novel, right? It's likely part of why many of you got into the profession. It's where you've seen transformation happen in students' lives, is in relationship with them and seeing them build strong relationships with others. But just to quickly summarize in this very text-heavy slide, the research is pretty unambiguous that at every step sort of along the way, relationships are critical to the things that our education system already cares about, right? So early exposure shapes career trajectories. That's one of the conclusions of the Lost Einstein study that hit last year out of Raj Chetty's shop. Developmental relationships, right? This is a term from the Search Institute, which is sort of in your neck of the woods and looks at the role of relationships in healthy development and how those relationships actually contribute to things like grades and attendance that we care about in our systems. America's Promise Alliance has found that caring relationships are key deterrents from students dropping out, and one of the most effective levers to re-engage dropouts is an access to a caring adult. And then fast forward into sort of college and career, a diverse and strong network is a competitive advantage. The key thing, though, to keep in mind here is that oftentimes, again, when we treat relationships as inputs, we invest in them along the way, but we don't think of that as investment in a long-term reservoir of social capital. And if we were to do that, if we were to think of a K-12 through post-secondary through career experience as constantly nurturing students' networks, we would actually be expanding optionality for them. Now, what is social capital? I keep using this term, and I suspect some of you have heard it before, but I'll give a couple definitions. Like anything in academia, there's like a bunch of arguments about what this actually means. But the crux of it is the idea that our networks have value. Robert Putnam is really well known in this space. He wrote Bowling Alone years ago, sort of noting the decline in civic membership. For our purposes of research, Putnam's measures tend to sit at the community level, and we think that's a little less helpful when you're thinking about your individual students' trajectories and how you're shoring up their ability to sort of survive and thrive. And so we actually prefer a definition at the sort of level of the individual from a researcher named Nan Lin at Duke University. And this is the idea that each of us can invest in a network that then has expected returns. Now let's break that down, because that can sound very technical and like we just go out and take advantage of people. Think about the last time you leaned on a neighbor or a family member for a favor, like babysitting, or in my case, dog sitting, maybe lending you money, maybe just lending you emotional support. Those are returns, right? Even if they're not sort of financial returns in every case. Those are returns on a network that you rely on and that you participate in. And as we think about this for young people, we came up with our own definition, and this is, I'll say, a working definition, and of course it's a little too verbose. But what we wanted to honor is that the idea that networks matter may need to be a little bit nuanced when we talk about young people, because as adults, we may know exactly what we're trying to get done in our lives and sort of network and build relationships with some of those goals or values in mind. For young people, those goals and values are still emerging. They're still being sort of formed in real time. And so we want to think of a network not as a fixed asset, but as an asset that will actually perhaps shift and change, and that we'll want to sort of move in different directions depending on young people's shifting goals and ambitions, right? So a very clear example of this would be if a high schooler doesn't know exactly what he wants to do in his life, allowing him to meet a bunch of people across a bunch of different careers actually makes a lot more sense than if a 28-year-old knows exactly the type of job he's trying to get and is trying to cultivate a network with that end in mind. Now, key to this also is not just the idea that relationships have value, but that value actually varies a lot by circumstance. So not all relationships are created equal, and that's actually a very good thing. And we use in our research a very simplistic mental model that I have up here, delineating what sociologists call strong ties and what they call weak ties. Now, a strong tie, and I would say schools are very much in the business of forming strong ties, caring relationships, enduring relationships. These are the closest relationships in our lives. They're the ones that we spend the most time with, that we nurture the highest degrees of trust and reciprocity with, that we are most likely to lean on, that we are literally most likely to lend money to. And we tend to have a few of those in our lives. But we also have a bunch of what sociologists would call weak ties, right? Marcia, I would call you a weak tie, and that is not a value judgment. We see each other probably once a year at conferences. We have lovely exchanges. We then open up opportunities to collaborate like what we're doing right now, but it's not necessarily a day in, day out nurtured connection. And that example of Marcia actually illustrates really beautifully the different sort of advantages that these two types of ties offer. Our strong ties offer care and resources, and for young people, they offer sort of the crux of healthy development. But our weak ties actually tend to contain new information and new opportunities, both because they're more plentiful and because they are less likely to have redundant information in the manner that our strong ties would, right? So my husband and my neighbor and my mother all know each other and know a lot of the same information. They're not actually going to be opening new doors for me, even if they're providing critical care. On the flip side, my weak ties are not necessarily there when I need someone to lean on. They could be, according to some research. Sometimes we actually want to divulge sort of struggles or confide in weaker ties because those are lower stakes. But those weak ties really are more varied and diverse sort of by virtue of the fact that we can have more of them, and they tend to know one another less. And I'd argue that in the education system, we need to continue to sort of churn away at what it takes to forge strong, lasting, caring relationships with young people to fuel healthy development. But we also need to start thinking about, well, what do students' weak tie networks look like? And how could we actually be more deliberate about that power of expanding access to new information and opportunities through weak ties, not just strong ties? One last thing to point out here, I could obviously talk about this forever, but a little nuance on this that I think is important depending on whether you're running sort of career programming or more traditional K-12 or post-secondary programming designed to expand options, is that controlling for all else, you're more likely to get a job through a strong tie, but the probability that you get a job through a weak tie is higher. So I'll just pause on that for a sec. What this means is if you know exactly what you want to do, exactly where you want to work, cultivating the heck out of a strong tie proves more fruitful. But if you do not yet have access to said strong tie and you actually are looking at a broader sort of breadth of options, your weak ties will likely pay greater dividends. So I think that really matters as we're thinking about how are we investing in students' networks and sort of messaging this to students. Now, this may be intuitive to those of you working with students furthest from opportunity, but networks were not all created equal, and we inherit different networks. And all of those networks certainly have assets, but they also, data would suggest, have some gaps. Parents' own professional networks vary by education level, so parents who have a bachelor's degree or more are more than twice as likely to know professors, CEOs, and congresspeople. In other words, more educated parents are disproportionately networked into the knowledge economy, which can then bear out as an advantage for those children of those parents as they look for everything from job shadow to internship opportunities all the way down to jobs down the line. There's also alarming gaps, growing gaps in enrichment spending, right? So affluent parents have sort of run amok on enrichment spending, and that's problematic if you think about all the sorts of sort of varied learning experiences you can access through out-of-school learning, but we actually think this is a proxy for something different and equally troubling, which is that students from low-income backgrounds are reporting unequal access to what are termed informal mentors. These are coaches, religious leaders, basically non-family adults in their lives. And you can see in this chart that when it comes to access to extended family or family, this gap is not significant. But on all other dimensions, young people from the top SES quartile, we think likely because of that boon in enrichment spending, are actually diversifying their networks to non-family members at much higher rates than their lower income peers. And we think we should be worried about this. If we care about access to opportunity, we have to keep sort of beating the drum of the achievement gap, but we also have to pay attention to this social side of opportunity. So luckily, that's a little bit bleak, but luckily there are some innovations on the horizon that we think are poised to make a real dent, not only in those gaps, but start to make a dent in some of the logistical hurdles that I think have kept schools from really thinking of networks and relationships as outcomes in their own rights and investing accordingly. And I'm going to walk through each of these innovations and spend a little more time on the second one around technology, but happy to talk offline about what we're seeing across all three of these sort of trend lines. And what I should say is when we started doing this research, I was intently focused on the K-12 system because I think we have to start early and often, particularly if you think about the effects that a network and access to mentors have on college-going behavior among students. But what I will share is that our current research that we've been doing over the past 6 months or so is focused on programs serving 16 to 24-year-olds. So we're starting to see these models crop up in post-secondary and career development programs, not just purely in the K-12 system. And in some ways, that sort of cross-sector activity is really exciting and reflects what I think is possible in a K-20 capacity. Please type in questions if you have them. I realize I'm just like saying words to a blank screen right now. So please like pause and stop me if anything I just said didn't make sense. But we'll dive into these innovations and maybe you guys can share if you're doing anything that aligns to any of these three. So the first type of innovation we looked at is integrated student supports. This is really wraparound services, but with almost a deliberate kind of connective tissue that has been missing in the past. And we'll talk about an example of that. The second is where technology has a play. And again, if I lose any of you in the next few minutes, the big headline here is that technology should not be a tool to sort of shore up strong ties in students' lives. Students absolutely need access to face-to-face relationships for healthy development, particularly young students. But that technology has an enormous competitive advantage when it comes to putting new weak tie connections within reach for students. And we'll talk about some tools that are doing that. And then lastly, sort of aligned with what I understand the sort of history of this group to be, and a lot of what Marcia has done, I know, in Michigan, is thinking about, as there's a lot of energy around instructional model redesign, there's an opportunity not just to create flexibilities in how, when, and what students are learning, but to actually start to make learning a more networked experience where new relationships are being put within reach and where existing relationships are getting deeper. And so we'll talk about a couple models we're seeing there. But these are just sort of three different buckets where innovation activity is starting to really take off. This first one, I'm curious if folks have heard this term integrated student supports. It's not recent per se, but it's getting a lot more attention recently. And like I said, this is not dissimilar to what have been dubbed wraparound services for many decades. And the sort of premise of wraparound services has always been, how do we support the whole child with all of the different services, non-academic and academic, that they need to thrive. And oftentimes this means actually co-locating those services at the school site, right? So having an on-site pediatrician, having on-site parent education. If anyone read the New York Times article about the LeBron James funded school in Akron, very much in line, their model is that was this weekend if anyone wants to look it up, but their model is very much in line with this sort of literature on integrated student supports. Now, we came at this from a different angle though, because what we saw happening in the field was, okay, there's an idea that we need to personalize, customize, and shore up supports, particularly for children growing up in poverty, to address the barriers to learning that poverty erects. But what we wanted to ask was, well, are there any models that are doing that through the lens of relationships, through the lens of shoring up not just a set of services, but a web of care, a web of human beings that are providing care to students? And what we discovered was one model that we highlight in the book, and this is not totally unique, but I think that they are, at least of the models we looked at, producing some uniquely breakthrough outcomes, is a model called City Connects that was founded by a professor named Mary Walsh at Boston College and is now scaling nationally. And the City Connects model essentially places a school site coordinator in every school that they partner with. And that coordinator's job is to understand sort of the profile and needs of each and every student, and then coordinate a network of care, not just from the school, but from all sorts of social services agencies around the school, around that student. Now, that may sound like other models you're familiar with, or some of the sort of intervention work you're already doing at your system. But here's the thing that we actually honed in on that makes the City Connects model somewhat unique, which is that that school site coordinator is actually pulling the teacher into those plans. And as a result, the teacher is actually better understanding the circumstances of each and every student that he or she is educating. And you see that bear out in their academic achievement scores. The distinction here is that if teachers are in that wraparound services loop, it actually may be strengthening the student-teacher relationship, not just providing the sorts of services that we know young people growing up in poverty need. And that teacher-student relationship, we know from research, can actually move the needle on academic gains. So whereas a lot of wraparound services do great work at expanding access to care, we haven't always seen that translate into academic outcomes. And instead, the City Connects model and models like it are starting to show that if you can create a coherent network of care that is premised on stronger relationships, you may actually see that bear out in outcomes that you care about. That's really wonky, I know, but it's a distinction that we're trying to sort of advocate for as actually states are starting to step up and pour more money into this concept of integrated student supports. There's another example here in the underemployment space called co-op. I'm not going to touch on it now, but one last thing to think about in integrated student support models that we're really excited about is thinking about, in that web of care, is there a role for peers and near peers to play as well, right? So often we think about students as costs to our system that we have to actually educate versus resources in their own right. And if you think about some powerful integrated student support models that are actually bringing near peer and peer tutoring to bear, that's another example of a sort of relationship-driven strategy versus a one-off intervention-driven strategy. So that, all of that I just said, if you go back to that mental model of strong ties and weak ties, this is all focused on what it means to shore up the strong ties that young people need to get by. But remember, right, we also need relationships to get ahead. We need relationships that expand and sort of our career possibilities. We need relationships with people willing to give us new opportunities. We need relationships with people willing to eventually hire us. And this is where the EdTech market, we think, gets really, really exciting. And I'm gonna do a quick and dirty disruption talk right now. Marcia, is that okay? I know this gets like wonkier by the minute, but it will help sort of unlock
Great.
where we see technology having a super exciting sort of potential to scale and diversify networks. And so for those who don't know, and I'll come back to that slide in a second, but for those who don't know, disruptive innovation, this term gets thrown around a lot. If you're out in Silicon Valley, every millennial you meet is like building something disruptive. Colloquially, it gets overused to mean anything new. But actually, disruptive innovation means something very specific. And I'm going to use an example outside of education. Normally, I'd make you guess what this is, but in the interest of time, this sort of cryptic photo is the first ever transistor. The first ever transistor came out, and what it could do was transmit sounds and signals. Now, at the time, in the late 40s when the transistor came out, the dominant technology in the market that did that transmitted sound, was called a vacuum tube. And it was much bigger and bulkier and more expensive than the transistor, but it was also more powerful. And so looking at this new technology, two different companies took two very different tacks. RCA, which really dominated that market at the time of sort of consumer electronics that transmitted sound so that you could hear things through the radio or your tabletop radio or the television. RCA looked at this transistor and said, wow, what if we could use this to power our big fancy radios and TVs? And they hired some of the original scientists out of Bell Labs who had created that transistor to try and make a transistor good enough for their products, right? And to continue to compete on sort of quality of sound and transmission. Across the ocean, a different company took a totally different tack, and that was Sony. And they looked at this transistor and said, wow, rather than try and make this technology good enough for fancy consumer electronics, what if we made it just good enough for sort of crummy consumer electronics? And that was where the transistor radio and eventually the Walkman was born. So these were cheaper, they were lighter weight, but they were actually quite appealing to a totally new customer base that RCA wasn't reaching, which was teenagers. And over time, those transistor-powered radios and Walkmen eventually became good enough to disrupt RCA, right? So what does this tell us? It tells us that disruptive innovations start by targeting circumstances where the alternative is nothing at all and improve from there. Okay, I know that's like a lot on a Tuesday morning, unrelated to everything I just told you, but I promise it's connected. So when we started to think about, well, what's happening in the technology market relative to relationships, we were actually excited to find that there were a lot of sort of Sony equivalents out there who were taking communications technologies and using them not to try and digitize students' existing relationships, but to put new relationships within reach where the alternative is nothing at all. Traditional social networking sites are not doing this. So Facebook, for example, is really helping us maintain connections. It's disrupting what sociologists would call the decay rates of our friendships, but not actually putting a whole bunch of new relationships within reach. Put differently on that front, for those of you who are on Facebook, like right now you are still in touch with people you absolutely should not be in touch with anymore, right? Like you're maintaining networks, you're keeping them on ice, and you know what your like first grade classmate ate for lunch yesterday because of these technologies. But the data would suggest that with a tool like Facebook, actually the vast majority of our quote unquote friends are people we know in real life, not people we otherwise wouldn't have met. And Mark Zuckerberg, before he was sort of called to actually much bigger demons that he has to defend, was actually pretty vocal about acknowledging this particular weakness in Facebook's algorithms. And this is a long quote, but the gist of it is that these algorithms are actually designed to help us more efficiently digitize our offline networks rather than find new people we quote unquote should know. But luckily, like I said, those Sony-like tools that are starting to crop up in education are actually doing something different. And they're starting to put new relationships within reach that otherwise students couldn't access. And if you think back to some of those network gaps that we looked at in the charts, that's really exciting when it comes to both addressing some network gaps. And it's also really exciting when you think about the cost, time, and geography limitations that historically have made it really hard to network with people from other places or even other sort of class strata. I don't have time to go over all of this. What I'll say, and I'll put this in the chat, we'll also have it up at the end, is that we've started tracking all of the tools that we've found on a site called whoyouknow.org, and you can click on the market map to find these. There's over 150 tools on there now. But as we started to track technology that was putting new relationships within reach, there were three big buckets of the ed tech market where these were emerging. And these won't come as a surprise to those of you who are thinking about sort of where relationships are currently out of reach. The first is college guidance access and success. We have abysmal guidance counselor to student ratios, right? The average is 1 counselor to 492 students in the United States. And what that leaves is all of this demand for guidance that is unmet in our current system. And so we're seeing tools like Student Success Agency crop up, which offers near-peer mentors who are themselves college students who can supplement college guidance with online advice to students that they serve month over month. So they're actually getting to know these students and helping them through the sort of college application gauntlet. The second big bucket is around project-based learning and industry engagement. So obviously those of you who are project-based learning purists, you can school me on some of that philosophy, but the broad trend here is the idea that real-world learning can actually go beyond real-world word problems or simulations to being actually in connection with people working in industry, right? And so tools like Nepris and EduCurious give teachers the chance to bring experts from industry into their classrooms over video chat, maybe to just share what they do and make learning more relevant, but maybe to actually start giving feedback on student work that's real world, authentic, and reflected in industry standards, not just academic ones. And the last bucket here is this broad piece of sort of academic support and encouragement. I love this example, so indulge me a minute to share it. I don't know how many of you have heard of Granny Cloud, but this is a technology developed by Sugata Mitra, who's best known for his work in sort of expanding learning in the developing world, starting in the slums of India where young people did not have access to formal schooling. And he began with just giving those young people a computer and watching them sort of driven by their innate curiosity learn. But what he noticed when he was sort of unlocking that self-driven learning journey was that learners would sometimes find themselves frustrated and disengaged. And he noticed that if he put literally originally sort of a granny from the village or the neighborhood with those young people, she may not be able to actually teach, but she could encourage and she could sort of ask questions and she could keep young people engaged for longer. And so he created a digital version of this dubbed Granny Cloud, where originally they were porting older women in to young people in these informal learning environments. And now it's everything from young men to older women who are providing this sort of support. And again, that's a relationship that otherwise was out of reach, being put within reach using technology. So why is this all really exciting? Well, it follows this trajectory of disruption, and it's beginning to disrupt the limitations of our inherited networks in a variety of ways. To echo what I said before, these are not strong tie investments, right? An online granny is not an actual grandmother, and if we conflate those, we're moving in the wrong direction, I'd argue. But it's actually starting to diversify access to weak ties, and that's especially exciting if you think about the so-called strength of weak ties, the fact that our weak ties are actually probabilistically more likely to offer us new information and new opportunities, and that they have that advantage even if they're not enduring and loving in the way that a strong tie would be. I already alluded to this talking about Nepris and EduCurious, but the last bucket of innovations, and then I'll open this up for questions that we're excited about, is sort of instructional model redesigns. Now, like I said, the Christensen Institute has thought a lot about blended and COMSI-based education for years, and a lot of that was about freeing up flexibility of how and when, and to some degree, what students are learning. But we also argue in this more recent research that those new models mark an opportunity to expand the relationships that students are learning alongside or with. And obviously there's a lot of energy in the high school redesign conversation around internships and work-based learning. And obviously there's also, given sort of the skills gap rhetoric and some people feeling that project-based learning is actually just a better pedagogy, which I am one of those. There's a lot of energy around project-based learning. What we sort of would say to the field is like, yes, these new pedagogies are exceedingly exciting. Can we actually use them not just to expand what students know, but whom they know? And as I've said on this slide, who knows what you know? That's a quote from Elliot Washer, the founder of Big Picture Learning. And what Elliot is getting at with this who knows what you know idea is that if you think about why relationships matter and access to opportunity, it's that in some ways they are like a credential, right? If you get to interact with someone and you get to understand what their strengths or expertise or sort of potential is, you are actually proximate to what they know in a way that otherwise GPAs and degrees and other things like that communicate. And so if we think about instructional models that are actually allowing more people to have visibility into what our students know and to be in relationship with students, we think that's a good thing. One thing to call out here, because I called out internship-based learning, we're currently looking at the model that Da Vinci Extension is pursuing in Los Angeles. Da Vinci Extension is basically a hybrid college that's using curriculum and sort of credentials from Southern New Hampshire University's online competency-based degree programs, but they're pairing that with in-person industry-based learning. And like many schools that commit to trying to afford internship experiences to all their students, they were hitting a wall, right? They were hitting a wall of having enough time and relationships to broker full-time internships for all of their students. And as a result, they kind of pared back this idea of an internship to create what they called project consultancies. And project consultancies are smaller dosage and require less face time. So students meet with local employers, they scope out a project that the employer actually needs done, they go back to school and work in teams on that project. They may have conference calls or sort of video conferences to check in on progress, but then 6 weeks down the line, they go back to the employer and sort of present their findings or their recommendations. And the exciting thing here is that you're not actually sacrificing the weak type relationships in industry that an internship can create, but you're doing it on a smaller basis of time and lesser cost from just a transportation and coordination standpoint. And so we're really excited about models like that that are not abandoning internships full stop, but are playing with the form function to make them more scalable while not sacrificing the actual relationships on the other side, right? So I'll end with 3 sort of provocations and then feel free to chime in with questions. These are just, as I've talked about this research, things that I hope people will sort of take away and noodle on. The first is that nothing I'm saying suggests that the school environments that you're working in are quote unquote antisocial, right? You're dealing in relationships every day, but because we treat those relationships as inputs instead of outcomes, we are often leaving sort of relationship value and return on investment on the table. The second, right, is that obviously I'm coming at this from the lens of how do we expand opportunity and address opportunity gaps. I don't want the takeaway to be, well, if we just invest in networks, we can solve for social mobility, right? There's very little to suggest you can network your way out of poverty. But where our conversation about access to opportunity, I think, has often emphasized both financial subsidies and human capital investments like school, I think we have forgotten that a network is also a critical ingredient to social mobility. And then my last little provocation, despite the fact that I work for Clay Christensen, who's made his brand predicting the future, is that we can't predict the future. You sort of see every week now headlines about this looming future of work and automation. And while I believe some of those predictions, I think the most the most sad prediction is that we can't predict the full future of work. But if we think about how to future-proof our current investments in young people, a diversified network is an asset that can control against that unknown. In the same way where you want to diversify your stock portfolio because you can't predict what the market's going to do, you want to diversify your network with an unknown sort of set of variables in the labor market. Shameless plug, this is the book that we published last year, but more importantly, as I shared in the chat as well, we have sort of free resources at whoyouknow.org and are going to continue to build out that site as we study schools and programs that are really focusing on relationships and outcomes. And always happy to discuss this offline, so I'm putting my email up as well. So hopefully, Marcia, that leaves enough time for questions or for you even just to respond, and happy to take this in whatever direction is helpful.
Julia, thank you. I will open it up to others as well. I mean, I really encourage those of you who are on with us live right now to, go ahead and ask your questions. We can, as I said, open up your microphones, or you can put them in the chat. If you get a chance, you could go take a peek at the Who You Know website that Julia put up. Kind of take a look at that. So I'm going to just pause for 1 second. Otherwise, I can jump back in.
Are people
Is there anyone who would like to have? their microphone open. I'm sorry, Julia.
Oh, I was just asking if the microphones are open. They don't look like it right now.
No, they're not. But it looks like mine isn't, and yet I'm on. So I don't maybe they didn't put in, and I did put it in, so I'm not quite sure. You're supposed to put in a PIN number and that kind of thing, and then mine didn't come up either. But if anyone would like to jump right in, go ahead. So I will for a second then, and hopefully, others will feel they can still continue to do that. Because I think you're right. We've been talking about the role of relationships in education for forever. And yet our focus seems to be constantly on something else. And yet, a lot of the studies, the HOPE study out of EdVisions, which was kind of the Elliott Washer area, when he did big picture learning, that HOPE study really did indicate that, building those relationships really did make an academic difference. It didn't just make a difference in the interaction with the student, but academically it made a difference. And I think that's kind of, you were referencing that. I think we all hope that it doesn't need to necessarily. I mean, in other words, if we can connect with a kid, there's nothing more important, because having been a classroom teacher for so many years, a lot of what, and I was a math teacher in junior high, I mean, a lot of what I did, a lot of the connections I made wasn't because I hoped they would become a better algebra student, but rather because, those connections are just critical in some of their lives more than others, depending on what's going on. But it always made a big difference. And then when I transitioned over, simultaneously, in the beginning, I worked for Michigan Virtual as an online teacher. And, in the early days, this was many, many years ago, it was difficult to make those connections because we didn't have the technology to necessarily do that as well as we can do it now. On the other hand, I had one student in my brick and mortar and one student on, who was taking another math class online with me. And in some ways, I connected to her better online because, it was one-to-one. So I guess I'm just kind of curious, how are we going to, how are we going to make this all work so that we can juggle all these balls in the air and prioritize them properly?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and it looks like Lisa's question is sort of similar. So backing up, one thing I'll say on sort of the research base, I still worry that when we say great relationships drive learning, we're still sort of relegating relationships to inputs. And the reason I worry about that from my perch at the Christensen Institute is that if we're treating relationships as inputs, they will be tempted to sort of look for efficiencies that could decrease our relationship investments while still getting the same outcomes, right? That could approximate human interaction while not being real human interaction. This is actually where virtual reality and chatbots, even though those things sound super exciting and disruptive, they make me nervous because they will not cure relationship or network gaps, right? They can create better information and better experiences, but they're not going to actually give you a reservoir of relationships that you can bank on down the line. So this is part of the reason there's a little bit of a tautology to what I'm calling for in the book, which is like, we need to treat relationships as outcomes. And until we do that, many school systems can nod and say relationships are important, but they're still viewing them as important ingredients to learning rather than outcomes in their own right. So I want to just put a point on that. In terms of sort of prioritizing and how do we make this all fit, I think part of the argument that we make is that there are chronic challenges in our education system that relationships can actually be a solution to, right? So the City Connects model is a clear example of like, for decades, we've been trying to address achievement gaps without fully addressing the barriers to learning that poverty erects. And coming up with a sort of relationship-centered way to do that appears to actually address those learning gaps in a way that just better academics has not. So that's one sort of solution. Another piece of this is sort of human capital shortages, right? Like, we can all look at the data around human capital shortages, but what that ignores is that our world is actually awash in human capital, but we haven't designed schools to take advantage of that. We haven't designed schools to actually welcome outsiders in. In fact, one of the sort of scenarios we talk about in the book is a parent who came to me saying, look, I am a professional. I even have some experience building curriculum. She was a scientist, but I go to my kid's school and they don't have a place for me. And her question was, where do I slot in, right? And so that is latent human capital that we're leaving on the table because we haven't designed school to be more porous and sort of networked. And then the last piece is this idea of sort of real world. Like, I think there's a cheap way to do real world learning if we start to involve others. The more expensive way is to try and build sort of fully simulated real world curriculum in a vacuum from the real world. And so these are sort of jerky think tank answers to your very pragmatic question. But I think all of these shifts, without these shifts occurring, this will feel like something you're just adding onto your plate, right? It won't be about a re-architecting of the system to be more caring and better networked. It will be saying, okay, teachers, educators, do everything you're doing and now do this extra thing as well. And I think that could be where this taps out if we don't actually re-architect the underlying system. Lisa, to answer your other question around educators' hesitation due to cost and time, I'll tell a little anecdote from what EduCurious has built. I mentioned them. So they're a nonprofit project-based learning curriculum, but that attaches an expert network to the project-based curriculum. So you can, as an educator, implement one of their projects, but then also bring in an industry expert over video chat to participate in that project. What they realized, right, was that there was there was a fairly sizable burden on the teacher to both be shifting instructional practice to project-based learning and trying to integrate this like random stranger into their classroom in a coherent and logistically feasible way. And so they've actually scaffolded this to sort of make low cost, low stakes interactions at the front end until the teacher feels sort of ready and sees where that expert fits. So they go from what they call a wave to a handshake to a huddle. A wave is just a one-way video where the expert can sort of introduce an idea to the course, but it doesn't even have to be synchronous. So the teacher can put that in whenever it makes sense to him or her. It doesn't have to be sort of a logistical feat. The next, this idea of a handshake is more of a scheduled interaction, but it's brief and it's not sort of high stakes and you're not trying to make it standards aligned. The ultimate one, this sort of huddle idea, is where on a repeat basis that expert is actually giving feedback on projects and interacting more with students sort of at multiple junctures in the project. And that really starts to make sense once teachers have kind of figured out the logistics and some of the instructional strategies in their classroom to do these projects and then can start to slot that expert in. So I think bearing in mind that there's likely a spectrum of engagement that we need to offer to educators who may be overwhelmed by the task of squeezing outside experts into their already packed lesson plan and pacing guide and all of that is important for tools in this space to keep in mind.
Thanks, Julia. I also think your previous explanation helped to answer that question too, is that it's not another thing they're adding on. It really is that we have to have a shift in the way that the learning or the educating is happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a coincidence that the Christensen Institute was writing about all these other things. And I was like, wait, there's another thing to add, right? Like, I think we see this all as one large movement to a more open and flexible learning environment. And so to be honest, right, like I'm in some ways most eager to research and partner with schools that have been on a redesign journey and are thinking about that sort of more flexible architecture and can now sort of add relationships as outcomes to that architecture. Even though I also want to work with systems that are still at the beginning of that journey as well. But, and not that we don't consult with systems, but as I'm looking for examples, some people who have been implementing blended, COMSI-based, project-based are more inclined to get excited about this because it sort of aligns with that larger strategic vision that they've already been implementing.
So one of the questions I have, Julia, is, in your experience connecting with schools, when I look at, Lisa just mentioned, how do we make this shift or making the shift? I mean, my question is kind of how are we going to do that? Because as I look back over initially, you know, the seat time waivers in Michigan created virtual school opportunities, not only statewide, but within the district. And ultimately that did transform delivery of learning to many. And in some cases, you know, to some students who, you know, couldn't or didn't want to be in a school at all, virtual learning became a great alternative. And then I mentioned to you in my email about our homeschool partnerships, and those have really taken kind of the same, all of us on the same journey as we observe them, these partnerships bringing in the community as a whole to really educate kids along with certified staff. It's not as though it's one or the other, it's really a combination. But as I, you know, observe all these, a lot of these are kind of on the perimeter and they're integrating a little bit more and more. Certainly a school like Elliott Washer and the High Tech High people and those guys who started the PBL, they started from the ground up. But, you know, my concern is that we're kind of trying to, you know, change our existing model. And I mean, it's painful to watch this because it just doesn't seem to be the easy way to do it. I mean, what have you seen? I mean, there's no one way to do anything anymore, but what have you seen that kind of helps, you know, get it more, start getting it going and create a more systemic opportunity for kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly not unfolding in the tidy way that one might hope, but I think one of the axioms in our research is that systems disrupt systems as opposed to one-off efforts disrupting, you know, the local school district, if that makes sense. And early days, Michael Horn, our founder, and Clay Christensen, writing about the rise of online learning in their sort of flagship book, Disrupting Class, predicted 2 phases of disruption, and we bring this up in our book as well, which is the first phase is actually just a disruption in the types of delivery models out there. So sort of what you described, Marcia, that you actually start to get a variety of delivery models where previously it was sort of more monolithic. And then the second phase of disruption is what we call in our research a facilitated marketplace, which is where actually those different delivery models can actually be mixed and matched rather than sort of creating yet another set of monolithic offerings. And so I think what we sort of, I don't want to use the verb predict, but what we're sort of looking to in the future is that traditional systems start to get disrupted, not in terms of the brick and mortar schools or the sort of local role that they play, but in the flexibility of what students in those systems can access. And so it's not a virtual school replacing a district, it's a district actually being able to say, here's a suite of offerings that these new models have now unlocked, and we're going to play the role of facilitating those offerings rather than being the exclusive delivery model. One of the examples we look at in the book that is sort of slowly moving in that direction, or 2 examples, I should say. One is VLAX in New Hampshire. That's their statewide virtual school, more or less. It's the Virtual Learning Academy charter school. And we've seen them start to multiply the pathways through which students can learn. And then school partners, district partners can pull in those different pathways rather than just pulling in traditional sort of fully baked online courses. Another model we look at that everyone's heard talked about maybe ad nauseum is Summit Public Schools, but again, people think of them as a sort of off-the-shelf platform, but really what their model reflects is a set of both in-school and out-of-school experiences that sort of vary, and they become the kind of coherent hub of those different experiences for students. Students do exhibitions out in their community every year in addition to doing online learning and project-based learning. So that's not a really tidy answer, but I think it's one of the places that kind of change management has gotten stuck is like an attempt to replace one monolithic system with another, as opposed to sort of think about what would it mean to sort of gradually have districts start to mix and match more and more options for young people within the governance structure of the district. But this is I have a researcher on my team who would be much more enthusiastic and adept at geeking out on this, Marcia. So if you want to offline talk to him, I will offer him up for that.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Are there other questions this morning? We have some of our strongest leaders on this webinar right now, Julia, as I look at some of the list of people. You know, as I said to you in my email, you know, I'm like the little Michigan co-op mom. I'm just like so proud of this group. I don't know if any of you, these are some of the superintendents, and these people are gutsy. They're really gutsy because they're really out there, you know, not only taking the extra time and making sure that their community and district is informed about what they're doing and why, but they're just, you know, they're really getting, you know, they're trying some really new things that could be seen as risky, but really in the long run are just providing these other options for their kids. So I don't know, I'll give one last shout out to them and see if any of you have any questions you would like to ask of Julia.
Yeah, and just thank you so much for joining, and you can obviously email me offline if that's preferable.
Thank you. So prior to the start of the webinar, Julia and I were talking about when she did her first webinar with us, and I actually dug into my Outlook calendar, Julia, and I found it was 2015, as you had thought. And prior to even finding that date, I recalled that when you and I were setting up, we did kind of a practice run prior to the actual webinar, and we were kind of scheduling all of this around your soon-to-be wedding, I believe. Did you get married in 2015?
I did, correct.
Yes, yes, yes. So, yes, I believe at the time you were Julia Freeland, and then we had the opportunity to know you after the wedding as well. And I believe in your book, your husband is also the co-author.
He is, yes. It was quite the collaboration, quite the strong tie collaboration. So, yes, thank you for reminding me to give him a shout out as well.
Yes, well, that's great. That's great. Well, I just so sincerely appreciate this, and hope that we get to see you in the fall at iNecole. If not, you know, we can intersect in other ways. But I thank you so very, very much for your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Julia.